Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this joint SPF and BPF webinar on post-COP26. What does it mean for our industry? I am Kevin Robertson, Managing Director of KR Developments and Chair of SPF. My task today is relatively straightforward, and I'm here to tell you the format for the webinar, introduce our panel, set the scene, and get the discussion going. So the webinar will run for about an hour and 15 minutes, or possibly slightly longer. We will firstly have a keynote speaker for 15 to 20 minutes, and then a panel discussion. There will be an opportunity for attendees to ask questions, so please post them in the Q&A section, and we will try and deal with these after the panel discussion. You can identify yourself or submit the questions anonymously. So the background to why we're here today. What happened at COP26? After extra time, an agreement was eventually reached in Glasgow. Alok Sharma wiped away a tear. All the world leaders, celebrities, government officials, activists, and private jets departed. And after 2 weeks in the spotlight, the city of Glasgow is now getting back to some normality. Greta's views, it was more blah, blah, blah. However, what was actually achieved, and what will this mean for all of us here that work in property and our industry? Thankfully, we are very privileged to have some of our leading industry experts that are going to share their thoughts with us. Firstly, I will introduce our keynote speaker, Nidhi Bezwar, Global Sustainability and Climate Leadership Director from JLL. Nidhi is an architect and sustainability expert with over 15 years' experience within the built environment sector. She has a proven track record in directing cross-functional teams to deliver and implement sustainability and net zero carbon. As Global Sustainability and Climate Leadership Director, she's taking forward sustainability and net zero carbon advocacy in the real estate world. Secondly, Charlie Foster, who's MD, Large Corporate Real Estate at NatWest Bank. Charlie heads up the large corporate real estate team at NatWest and also has responsibility for leading the bank's overall sustainability agenda, with the primary goal to support real estate customers of all sizes to respond to the climate challenge and transition to low carbon. Thirdly, we have Fernando Amamaya, Sustainability Director from Landsec. Fernando leads on the environmental programme and net transition plan, ensuring that Landsec achieves a science-based target by 2030. She is also responsible for sustainability reporting, climate risk and disclosure in line with TCFD recommendations and investor engagement on ESG. And last but not least, Peter Kerr, who's a director at Attila 10. Peter has over 25 years' experience in building services design and has an interest in health and well-being in the workplace, assessing how we deliver our carbon zero future and the implementation of smart building technologies. Now that I've introduced this great team, Nidhi, if I can now hand over to you to let us know your key thoughts on COP26 outcomes and what this means for our sector. Nidhi.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Kevin. Good morning, everyone. So what happened at COP26? I think we all witnessed, whether virtually or in person, we all came back with a view or an opinion about how it went. Now, before I give my view on how it went, let me share what I've heard from others on their views on this. The agreement at COP26 aimed at limiting our global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius Now, from what I've read and heard, most negotiators and climate activists from developing nations were unhappy about it. Some young people called it greenwash. The chairman of the conference, British Minister Alok Sharma, called it fragile victory. The UN president said the words, "This is an important step, but not enough." Boris Johnson, our prime minister, said, "It's a big step." Now, to me, COP26 meant no excuses. Let's stop business, collaboration, partnerships, and make our industry's decarbonization commitments a reality. A true call to action needed at a much, much faster pace than before. For the first time this year, the annual climate conference that we had a specific focus on cities, regions, and buildings. And as well as we know, this contributes to about 40% of the global carbon emissions. Now, the pressure is on our real estate industry, the built environment, to make its decarbonization commitments a reality. Now, it was noticeable how the central role real estate or built environment plays in the decarbonization transition. It was increasingly understood by everyone. As occupiers, lenders, insurers, investors, regulators all push towards net zero carbon, our industry, which includes developers, contractors, architects, engineers, advisors, and consultants in the real estate sector, they will need to step up to align with our stakeholder demands. I think let's focus on the outcomes for now, the ones that affect our industry. Now, I'll start with some key commitments and pledges and the relationship with our industry, and then go on to summarize the big developments that will impact later on. To start with, there were two big pledges or commitments that came out of this conference. The first one, on day 4, whilst most focus has been on CO2 reduction, the contribution of methane to climate change was realized. The global methane pledge was identified that seeks now to curb methane emissions by 30% by 2030. And this now has been signed by more than 100 countries. I don't know how many of you are aware, but methane is the second most abundant greenhouse gas after carbon dioxide, and it contributes to about 20% of the global emissions. Now, methane is also 25 times worse than carbon dioxide at trapping heat in the Earth's atmosphere. And so far, we did not have targets to curb those emissions. Now, you could argue if cows should or should not wear masks that filter the methane that they emit, which was one of the technologies that got coverage in COP26 this year. Now, but for our industry, what it means is that it stresses the fact that we need to move away faster from the gas connections, the fossil fuel consumption, mainly gas-fired boilers, which run on natural gas, which is a fossil fuel made mostly of methane. Now, the UK government does offer some grants, mainly in England and Wales, to install heat pumps and so on and so forth. But there is still a lot to be done by our government, for our industry to make this more of a reality and embed that into our built environment sector. Now, after that, the second big commitment that came out was on day 4. It was the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use. Now, more than 130 leaders, which represent about 90% of the world's forest, committed to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030. Now, about 100 corporations also spoke about their commitments to reverse the decline of nature and get nature positive by 2030. Now, for our industry, what it means is that this is one of the critical topics that we need to address in the race to net zero. And it should include bringing nature back into the built environment. And also, we should be talking about sustainable land use. For too long now, the built environment's real estate industry, we have sidelined nature and biodiversity. I think nature-based solutions such as rewilding programs in cities, living walls, green roofs, sustainable urban drainage systems, more green spaces within the new developments. I think all of this now need to be carefully thought of when we are designing, repurposing, retrofitting our real estate sector. Now, these have dual benefits, of course, for people as well as nature, and it makes communities, development cities more livable and improves our health and well-being, of course. So these were the two big commitments that came out of COP that I wanted to highlight and say that this directly or indirectly does affect our industry. Now, there were some developments that happened as well, which what I feel would accelerate the pace of decarbonization within the real estate. There are 4 of them in total. I'll go through them one by one. The first one is access to capital and debt would now depend on a net zero carbon plan. Now, the first thing that came out, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, the pledge which came out of COP26, is from more than 450 organizations in the financial sector to move about 130 trillion US dollars of funds under their control into investments where recipient is committed to net zero emissions by 2050. Now, in addition to this, the UN's Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which is responsible for about 10 trillion US dollars in assets, committed to phase out thermal coal by 2040 for all the assets. So now this will have a huge impact on our industry. Now, I read somewhere that about 80% of the buildings that will exist in 2050 already exist today. So this means buildings as they stand will need to be repurposed to deliver a net zero carbon emissions. And in the process, we just not have to look at operational carbon, but also embodied carbon. And this has to be part of the equation of the net zero carbon plan. Now, if you do not have a net zero carbon plan, the financial sector will hesitate or will not provide you with the right capital or debt needed to fund your development. So that I think is a big move, a very big transition into our sector, and that will affect dramatically how we move forward now. The second development that happened, and I think we all know we should anticipate more commitments, clarity and coordination on the carbon finance that I spoke to you about. So there are 2 ways of pricing carbon, the emissions trading and the carbon taxes. Both saw a boom at COP26. So if we were to look at COP26 climate negotiations, which resulted in a new global carbon market framework, which is called now Article 6, it has come after 6 years of negotiations. Now, these negotiations now pave the way for expanded global public and private carbon emissions trading markets. So I'll explain to you later on how this affects. And the second part of it was the put out of the action plan, or the call to action to the G20 countries to implement global carbon pricing, as opposed to having over 60 pricing systems or schemes that exist worldwide, to have a global structure to this. Now, these developments should one day impact real estate values for better or for worse. For the built environment sector, we will have to pay a price if the path to net zero carbon is not clear or it does not exist. Now, this will force developments and buildings to achieve net zero carbons for sure, but there is a lot to it to understand when it comes to valuations and how we carry out valuations as it currently stand, and adopt a new way of approaching valuing our built environments. Now, we already have to pay carbon tax on new developments not meeting zero carbon in most areas of London and some cities in the UK. Now, this carbon pricing, although relies on operational carbon. Now, this is currently, as I understand, is being reviewed, and what we need to also include is the embodied carbon aspect of things, and look at the targets for repurposed buildings as well. So this carbon tax, carbon price will play a massive role in understanding how we factor the transition or the action plan to zero carbon for our industry. Now, the third development that happened was global climate disclosure rules. Now, these rules will now continue to strengthen and align. The International Financial Reporting Standards announced the new International Sustainability Standards Board to develop a global consistent climate disclosure standard for the financial market. Now, what this means is that financial institutions will have a global way of reporting their sustainability and carbon credentials as they go forward. So the financial services and markets have an important role in the transition to a more sustainable future, as we all know. And they've been incorporating and considering environmental, social, and governance factors into their operations, products, and services, as we know as ESG these days. The Financial Conduct Authority released a paper recently for consultation this month, which is called the Sustainability Disclosure Requirements and Investment Labels. And I think all of this together, what it means is we'll have a global, consistent way of looking at investments into this sector as we go forward, and it will definitely affect the way we operate. Now, the fourth development, if I were to point out, was for us to expect now more disruption from technology and innovation to drive low carbon economy. Now, technology and innovation were central themes at COP26, where at Glasgow, I think the Glasgow Breakthrough Agenda was launched. It focused on scaling up clean tech and reducing costs. There were some commitments made around concrete zero and steel zero. Now, this highlights the desire to push the net zero carbon conversation beyond operations. And again, I'm stressing on the fact that the embodied carbon side of things need to be really accounted for as we go forward in the industry, making these changes to zero carbon. Now, also the scale of retrofitting challenge is huge and critical. There is expected to be about 5.2 trillion US dollars that'll be needed to be invested in the next decade alone to decarbonize our current built environments. So there's a whole host of things linked to technology and innovation where we have to come together to deliver this. Now, while COP26 confirmed that our industry is now making progress, there is a long way to go. Companies have identified targets. However, they don't have an action plan in place. According to GRL's recent Decarbonizing the Built Environment report, only 18% of the organizations currently have an action plan for their real estate portfolio. And that is a huge gap. I think to guide the real estate investors and occupiers in their net zero portfolios, there are lots of guidances that have been produced. There's one particularly where the World Economic Forum and JLL joined up to produce a roadmap to get to net zero carbon buildings. Now, the opportunity to improve our collective performance and to reduce carbon emissions as an industry is huge. Now, to sum it all up, radical collaboration is essential in this decade of action. None of the commitments and pledges made at COP26 will matter if they aren't followed by swift action. We cannot get there on our own, which is quite understood. And now we as an industry need to leverage the outcomes from COP26 and help shape the roadmap for companies that put the built environment at their forefront. Now, this requires radical collaboration, like I said, with all parties, people, companies, NGOs, all voices to tackle climate crisis in an equitable and inclusive way. I'd like to end with a thought, or rather a reminder to ourselves, that at COP27, the world will be looking for a proof of action and bolder commitments from our industry. The hard work starts now. Thank you.
Thanks, Nidhi. That was a great summary and outline of the challenges that we face as an industry. So thank you very much for that. If I can now open up the discussion with our other panel guests, and the first question is to our three panel guests. So we maybe start with Charlie and then Fernando and then Peter. But the first questions are, what are your key takeaways from COP26? And do you agree with Nidhi? So if we can throw that over to you firstly, Charlie.
Yeah, sure. And I think a very comprehensive sort of coverage and summary there from Nidhi. So yes, absolutely agree with the key points that she's brought out. And I think that point around radical collaboration is really key and is a theme that we are starting to see mobilised. And I think the part that finance plays within that was great, that finance played such a key role for COP. But we're never going to be able to do this on our own as an industry. We're just one part, but absolutely we need to play our role in terms of being that facilitator and enabler. I think another role that COP26 played was probably prompting some action and commitment from government. So we saw the heat and building strategy came out, and I think COP26 was a useful deadline to prompt that. I mean, there's further debate about the content of the heat and building strategy, but at least we saw something come from them after delays down to COVID, amongst other points. But I think that bit around how do you pull together the relevant stakeholders for all the parts of the chain is the bit that will enable action to be taken rapidly. And I think also a lot of the pledges that have been made and the commitments have been made from very large organisations. So how do we support the smaller organisations? And we see that with the customer base, where the smaller real estate landlords are still really struggling with what the climate challenge means for them. And they don't necessarily have the bandwidth or capacity to dedicate an individual on their management team to lead on sustainability. So how do we get those lessons out to them? How do we help and support them with the sort of transition and the action? And I guess that would be my other point, is a lot of focus around green, and the transition and how we mobilize that transition is going to be really important. So how do we take brown assets and move them across? And they're not necessarily going to hit green in one go. It's not going to be one solution. So how do we make sure that we're putting the money into where it's needed most along that transition path, rather than diverting attention just to assets that are either already green or which are easily made green? How do we tackle the thornier stuff where the economics are more difficult to justify?
Thanks very much for that, Charlie. Fernando, what are your thoughts?
Yes, now first, I completely agree with all points that Nidhi has raised. Yeah, and it was very comprehensive. So I took many notes. Now it's the time for action. I think COP26 confirmed that the level of awareness around climate change and the urgency for action is increasing. So at COP21, great to have very long-term commitments, kind of bold commitment, very long-term. Now it's not enough anymore. So we saw that kind of very clear. The society is asking companies, don't come with another commitment. Show me how you're going to deliver on your targets, how much that's going to cost. Show us clear actions. And I think the second point, again, that was mentioned already, but it's about this. We also, over the last few years, we saw the sector start realizing that, yes, operational carbon and energy is important, but they only represent 50% of the problem. The other 50% is around embodied carbon. Kind of sometimes 50% of the whole life carbon emissions of a building happens even before the building is occupied, so during the construction process. So how we can tackle that? How we can make sure that we are looking carbon from a holistic approach, and how can we make sure that we are decarbonizing our building, transitioning our builds without basically just advancing all the carbon emissions up front by trying to retrofit everything, redevelop everything at once without balance the kind of what's going to be the impact if I just have lots of embodied carbon now just for the sake of reduce a little bit of energy moving forward. So I think that's something that it started becoming clear. And I think the UK GBC whole life carbon roadmap makes that kind of bring attention to the whole life carbon, that all players in the sector needs to realize that we need to take a balanced approach and decarbonize, yes, but let's not approach that from a view, let's just redevelop everything and make green buildings, brand green buildings from scratch. So I think these are my two key points.
Thanks very much, Fernanda, for that. And Peter, what do you think? Are you going to agree with everybody?
I don't tend to, Kevin. But to be fair, I agree with Nidhi in terms of a lot of the elements that she mentioned. And I just want to pick up one of the points as referenced as finance. You know, and I think people use finance as a bit of an excuse not to change, which is quite infuriating. And I think we've seen that with, if you like, China and India's response to the question of, you know, removing coal, if you like, in the future, if you like, from their fuel mix. And again, they're saying, oh, we're a developing country. You know, these two countries are amongst the richest countries in the world. And, you know, they're using the developing country question. And that's quite frustrating from my perspective. And again, you know, one of the things that we do, if you look at the UK versus the global situation, UK, we pat ourselves on the back because we're doing quite well, if you like, in terms of the whole, embodied carbon. We've got lots of legislation coming into play. We've got lots of recommendations, lots of guides. Our operational energy is low. If we go all electric, our electrical networks are, significantly reduced over the last 10 years. So that all looks good. But the thing is when we measure this, we use a thing called territorial evaluation, right? So what we do is we just measure what's happening within our country. But we don't measure what we purchase. And I think that's quite annoying, because what we're doing is we are, if you like, fueling, the economies of developing countries who are using fossil fuels to create the products that we purchase. And again, why are we doing that? Because again, we might, as I say, pat ourselves in the back in the UK, say we're doing well, but then we go and we actually purchase materials from countries which are talking about they're obviously looking at reducing, if you like, coal and things like that and carbon emissions. But remember, this is a global issue. This is a global issue that we need to be dealing with. And something needs to be done about, if you like, this unabated, if you like, emissions from these countries that we purchase most of our materials from. Or what we should be doing is actually bringing some manufacturing back, if you like, to the UK. And we can start manufacturing some low carbon materials that then, guess what? It reduces our embodied carbon content. That's really good because it's coming from a zero carbon source. And then we actually have a proper, if you like, zero carbon trajectory. And actually that in my view is, if you like a vision of what I see is what we should be doing in terms of COP. That's the kind of big things from my perspective. Another big thing for me, again, was when the transport question, Needy didn't pick up on the transport, but there was also a point made about, let's move towards increasing our, electrification of transport. And I'm going, what are we doing? What we're saying is we're continuing to feed the habit of transport, right? So what we're doing is let's move from our diesels and our unleaded fuel, fuel sources, and then let's buy electric cars, rather than actually consider how do we remove more vehicles from the roads. I mean, so the quick question is, let's go to electric. And you're going, well, that's just more energy consumption. Why are we not looking at greater and more tangible approaches to reducing this aspect of vehicle ownership, looking at better public transport across the globe? Because when you look at public transport in a lot of other countries as well, that is an absolute mess. You look at the US, I mean, everybody just drives a car. I mean, it's just the way it happens over there. So that would come into things like town planning policies and all of these other big things, all big subject matters. But again, I think there's a few things that should be discussed at hopefully COP27, because they certainly weren't discussed at COP26. So that's some of the big points that I feel like my takeaway. So I was a little bit frustrated with it. But I think from a UK perspective, we're on a good trajectory. And it's very difficult for a small nation, if you like us, to influence the global situation. Particularly places like China and the US and India, who are the three biggest polluting countries in the world. So there you go.
Thanks, Peter, and thank you all for your thoughts and on the sort of key headline outcomes from COP26. We'll try and drill down a wee bit more now into how it's directly affecting us going forward in the property sector. And Needy, if I can come back to you, for the first time, this COP had a day dedicated to the built environment. But do you think there was sufficient focus on the critical role of buildings and property? How can we ensure that government has the built environment right at the heart of its sustainability plans?
Thank you for that. Well, that's a very good question. And I think since it was the first time that this conference addressed buildings and the built environment, recognized the importance of it to actually embed that into the agenda, I think definitely there was focus given to it. And when it comes to looking at how the government can play a part, I think there is now, as I said in my keynote speech, it is now time to take action, to go forward with what we've got. And we can't wait for governments to make plans, unfortunately, for a lot of things. Governments will make plans, but they will make them eventually. I think built environment has been a part of the problem when it comes to carbon emissions. We contribute to about 40% of the emissions, but we are also part of the solution. And we have to make sure that we move and shake it ourselves rather than wait for the government to do it. And there are various different ways how we can enable that. I think through collaboration, like I said, through various different consultation that happens with the documents that the government releases for making plans on these things. So overall, I think lobbying is another way. What BPF does is another thing. They are the voice of the real estate industry. So I think there are various different ways where we can try and push the government to implement or make things right. But at the same time, we can't wait for them to make those changes. We have to lead the change and make things happen. And then at the end, present some sort of examples for what, like Charlie pointed out, there are companies and industries that are very small and they need support on this low carbon, zero carbon journey. And when they're leading the way, they're putting together case studies or examples for those smaller industries or companies to come forward and use the shortcomings or the learnings from those experiences to implement that within their business plan. So overall, I think to wait for the government to do something or come up with new regulations, I think it is us as leaders in the industry to make things happen and deliver the change.
That's great. Thanks for that, Nidhi. And I agree with you. Yeah, why wait? Let's take the initiative and make things happen. That's normally what the property industry does. And we should continue to do that with this massive problem. So
can I just add something on that as well? Is I think that central government have definitely got a role to play. And the more that they can put into policy and regulation, the easier it becomes, because then there's a consistency of approach. But the local authorities have done some really innovative things as well. I think you mentioned before about the cities and the targets that those the big cities have got. I think working with the local authorities, tapping into what they're getting up to, there's some really good pilots that are being run as well around sort of retrofit plans, etc. So I think there's a bit around making sure we're looped in with what local authorities are doing and using those as examples that are positive around and seeing where we can collaborate with local authorities.
Thanks for that, Charlie. Another question, and then I was going to bring in Charlie, Peter and Fernando on this one. So at COP26, we saw the launch of the whole life carbon roadmap, which sets out a pathway and vision for the sector to deliver our net zero ambitions by 2050. Charlie, I know you were on the steering group that oversaw the delivery of that roadmap. Why did NatWest decide to get involved? And what do you hope the roadmap will achieve?
Yeah, so NatWest has been a member of UK GBC for a number of years. Real estate's a really important sector for us. And then obviously we've made some very significant commitments around climate, and UK GBC are an extremely useful body in terms of the work that they're doing and unpicking what the climate challenge means for the real estate industry. And I think, again, they're doing a great piece around lobbying, and the roadmap was a good example where they were very clear with policymakers about what their asks were, and very forensic in the group that they managed to bring together. And it was across the whole sort of built environment stakeholder piece. So everybody had a voice there, and NatWest 100%, we've got our part to play. So if we're not in the conversation, then we're missing out. We're not going to be able to support our customers with what needs to happen. And I think UK GBC have been consistently good at provoking the next topic for real estate, and then actually going about and bringing the right people together to have the conversations and to give sort of tangible outputs and to bring topics to life. So the roadmap, I think, goes a long way to bringing detail on a topic where we'd otherwise started to stray into it either being too theoretical, or where people were using phrases and terminology that they didn't understand what that would actually mean in practice, for the steps that would need to be taken. And it's still not straightforward, and much of the roadmap is very technical, but I think the right people were in the room for those conversations. So hopefully it gives a useful starting point for people. And again, the policy overview was a really clear document as well.
Thanks for that, Charlie. Peter, one for you. I know that Attila 10 were heavily involved in the roadmap's work on new builds. Will the future home standards and planned changes to building regulations deliver net zero ready homes and buildings in England? If not, what more do we need to do? And Are there any lessons from England, from Scotland?
Probably say some lessons for England from Scotland, if
Yeah.
I'm being honest. Again, you know, looking at the Part L, if you like, 2021 guidance, that guidance just matches the current, if you like, guidance in the Scottish regulations. So that's what they're moving towards, what we're currently doing. So again, Part L amendments are not going far enough. All right, but there is the Future Home Standard, and the Future Home Standard does take it another level. It was highly condemned, if you like, in the consultation and not going far enough. But I think the condemnation is a bit unfair, to be perfectly honest, because there is a limit, if you like, to what you can do to a building to actually reduce its operational carbon emissions without costing yourself a huge amount in embodied carbon. You know, you start to think about it, it becomes an exponential material increase, if you like, to actually achieve small marginal increases in operational benefits. So I think any decision, if you like, that's made in a building to reduce its operational carbon should be evaluated against its embodied carbon input. And I think the delay, if you like, for the new home standard is good, because hopefully our industry will start to decarbonise the manufacturing process of materials and reduce the embodied carbon content before we start pushing that into buildings, increasing their insulation, you know, looking at these, if you like, the thermal bridging properties of buildings. All of these kinds of aspects will be coming into play, both in the English standard and also in the Scottish standard. In the Scottish building regulations, they're taking it a bit too far too quick. Kevin, you know, that's one of the challenges that we face in Scotland. The potential consultation that's out for our equivalent of Part L, which is Section 6. There's two options available. Option 1 is a tangible benefit and a better, it's improved over Part L, but option 2 means a huge amount of embodied carbon needs to go into a building to actually deliver its operational carbon targets. So I'm hoping that isn't too overly complicated, but you can obviously ask some questions in the Q&A about it. But in essence, it's about balancing material input versus, if you like, its operational benefit. One of the big things that has changed, though, is the removal of, if you like, fossil fuel or direct emissions, as they call it, in the standards. So actually, the removal of direct emission fuel sources, i.e. things like boilers, gas boilers and things like that, oil-fired boilers, all of these kinds of things will be removed in Scotland 2024 and in England 2025. So both of those, if you like, various standards that are out there are looking to deliver, if you like, that first step. And the way I always look at it is not just about carbon counting, it's actually about what you're putting into the air. So if you think about, can we stop putting stuff into the air by what we're doing? Actually, you solve that question of carbon a lot. So that's another thing, you kind of flip it if you're thinking it's about actually bettering our air quality, which will help our climate. So that's my piece, Kevin.
Thank you, Peter. No, as you say, it is very complicated, but we're all going to have to learn about it and take action. So that's the key message, really. Fernando, yeah. I think there are over 100 organisations involved in developing the roadmap, including Landsec, a great example of the sector coming together and showing leadership. How can we build on this? How can we encourage greater cooperation and collaboration across the sector?
Yes. Landsec has collaborated to the roadmap. We provide some feedback, and also Mark Allen, our CEO, provides some words for the forward of the report. And for us, what's great about the roadmap is that, as mentioned before, it clearly highlights what the sector needs to do to decarbonize, to transition to net zero, and including both embodied carbon and operations. So looking kind of the whole life cycle of a building. And one thing that is great, I think that one of the main focuses is what we want policymakers to do and how we need that to be, how we want that to advance. But at the same time, there is kind of a stakeholder action plan where it lists 14 different stakeholders that somehow has some interaction with the built environment, from, of course, developers and landlords, but also occupiers and investors, and how each one of these players, they can have a role to decarbonize the sector. And that's very, very powerful, because That means that any kind of, all different sectors, all different players can have a touch point and they have a role to play. And I think that mentality that no single company or no single sector will be able to decarbonize and get to net zero without collaboration is very powerful. Because I think for some years ago, it was a race. Which company will have the most kind of ambitious target, usually about scope 1 and 2. So I want to have the kind of most ambitious target to reduce my own emissions without too much consideration about the impact in the value chain. That's not enough anymore. So I think the Science Based Target Initiative launched the net zero standard, saying that no company will be able to claim net zero if they don't reduce their emissions on average by 90%, and that those emissions should include at least 95% of their scope 3 emissions. That means that no single company will be able to claim net zero if their whole value chain is not decarbonizing as well. So that's very powerful. And I think we need to keep building on that mentality, on that level of collaboration to be able to decarbonize and transition. So, and when you think about any particular build, so if we're approaching a new development from the beginning, I'm just going to use Landsec example, but I think that's the reality that we are seeing among all the majority of peers in the sector. We need to engage with architects very early on to make sure that the design of the build is going to be as lean as possible, so we can reduce the embodied carbon by using less material. But you can reduce embodied carbon based on from a design perspective at some point. There is a limit because you don't have net zero steel yet. So you are going to have some emissions from materials. So until all the materials they decarbonize, the manufacturing process decarbonize, you are not going to be able to develop a true zero carbon building. So initiatives as Nidhi mentioned about the Steel Zero is very powerful because Landsec joined that commitment, that initiative. And the idea is all those organizations that procure steel, and I think there is another one for concrete as well, but so far we joined the Steel Zero one. We are committing ourselves to procure net zero steel. So that's a demand signal. It can incentivize the steel manufacturers and steel companies to go and produce, go invest in technology because there is demand on this side of the table. So please go because we are committing to purchase that. And that gives a reassurance for the manufacturers that they can go, there will be market for that. And this is just talking about the new developments. When you think about operation, more than kind of 40% of the overall energy consumption in our buildings is associated with our occupiers. So there is no way that we are going to decarbonize and reduce energy in our operations if we don't collaborate with our occupiers. So that's why we need to start engaging with them. And it's not only about sharing data anymore. It's about how can we start joint initiatives? How can I help you? Because we have more expertise sometimes in understand how FENCOI units, HHUs, they work than our occupiers. How can we use our knowledge to help our occupiers to identify opportunities to reduce energy and to overall decarbonize the whole building? So I think for me, these are good examples and how we can use the roadmap to really leverage the collaboration required to get to net zero.
Thanks very much, Fernando, on that. I don't know if any of the other panel members have anything more to say in collaboration at this stage.
I think, see, just picking up on the UK GBC guidance, one of the big things, and Fernando picked up on it, is behavioural change. And behavioural change is actually one of the big, if you like, unknowns in the industry. And that's the kind of thing we need to tackle, is about how people are using their buildings. And it's not just about the facilities managers and stuff, or tweaking the set points and stuff. It's not about that. It's actually about how the users of the building are experiencing and using their buildings more efficiently. You know, getting more finite detail to help inform that behavioural change is important. And again, in that UKGBC guidance, it talks about behavioural change, and I thought that was a really strong piece for me that came out of that.
Thanks, Peter. Just a reminder to our audience that there will be an opportunity for dealing with some of your questions. So if you want to submit anything, please do so. Moving on now to some of the financial implications, and it was great to see so many people from finance talking very well about climate change and the plans they have, and the whole movement towards green finance. So some have claimed, and this really for Charlie and then Needy, some have claimed that COP really shifted the dial in green finance, moving targets to transition plans. Do you agree with this? How critical is green financing to the whole sustainability agenda? So Charlie, firstly to you, and then maybe Needy can come in.
Yeah, look, and I think I said before that it was great to see the focus on finance, and so really positive, and 100% that finance can be hugely influential in terms of being a facilitator and enabler of some of the activity. And we are also heavily regulated, so it is in some ways easier to use us as a prompt into other industries. So if we look at how is the regulator engaging with us, they're starting already. We saw a stress test based on climate, the climate risk associated with our lending books, and the implications of this. I mean, at the minute, this is a sort of trial run, the regulator working through what the implications are, but the end result of this will be that there will be a capital impact of banks where if you are lending to activities or to companies where the carbon footprint is higher, because they are then more exposed to both physical and transition risk of climate change. The feed through of that is that there will then be an impact on the cost and potentially the availability of funding for those companies where they haven't either got a transition plan in place or where their activities are not taking into account the full sort of risk spectrum associated with climate change. For me, though, there's still that bit, though, about there's some unanswered questions about how we support those that cannot afford the transition, and some of the unintended consequences if finance is removed from areas of society. And for real estate, that could be physical, communities where the finance is removed without thinking about how do we provide the safety net, or how do we support those aspects to move into the new way of doing things. So a little bit of a question mark about that. And as well, we want to encourage the financing of the transition. And at the minute, it feels quite blunt about the assessments that are being done of looking at green assets rather than looking at what's the improvement being made, what's the trajectory for those assets, and are you taking the steps that are needed to get there. So definitely very encouraged by the talk around transition plans and looking at that, and that's actually how we've approached it as a bank. Is we're not going to yank the financing from companies, but we need them to have those a credible transition plan. And then there's a lot of work that's going into working out what is a credible transition plan, what is stretching enough, who are the external parties that can verify the plans that are being put forward, and working out. So we've made a big pledge around halving the carbon impact of our financing activity by 2030, but stopping and trying to unpick what the carbon impact today of our financing activity is not straightforward. But absolutely, that's a part that we can then play with, using that knowledge to support our customers in understanding their own carbon footprint. And I think the bit around embodied carbon, again, is quite a complex piece to try and unpick across many sectors. But as I said, finance is a very obvious starting point because of the regulation, because of the disclosures that we have to make for us to be a starting point for testing out some of the ways in which you measure carbon and some of the ways in which you incentivize behavioral changes and make it an easier decision and shift the economics so that we're really pricing for carbon and how we use materials and how we're kind of engaging with industrial activity as well.
Thanks, Charlie. Needy, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, I absolutely agree with Charlie with what she said. It's more on understanding. There's a question mark, like she pointed out. I think there's now, when we're looking at assets and looking at due diligence at early stages to understand, what's the cost of transition, what's the cost of converting the brown asset to deep green or green. It's that sort of unknown at the moment, but at the same time, our valuations methodology that existed so far, I think that needs to change as well to understand and now factor in this cost. So when you're looking at estimating value of building or an asset, it accounts for this transition cost. It accounts for all the factors associated with the risk and the due diligence that have been carried out relating to climate change and sustainability and zero carbon. So I think the model as it exists, the traditional valuation model, needs to improve and needs to change dramatically at this stage now, so that we can get the right sort of finance options for give the right finance options to our clients. I mean, there are lots that currently exist. There are green loans, there are funds, there are bonds. I think using them to drive this transition for the assets, the built environment, I think that's something that we need to now take it forward. There are, like I said, these initiatives that currently exist, but not commonly known to all. And I don't know, but surprisingly, I understand that they're not very difficult to access. So yes, you do need to have a plan in place. As long as you have a plan in place, a monitoring system in place, you should be able to, access those finances and use it for your benefit or for the client's assets that you want to improve on. But it's just having that kind of a model in place where the industry understands and we all basically talk the same language when it comes to valuations, due diligence, transition plan, and then the finance associated with it.
Thanks for that, Nidhi. And I think that leads nicely into the next question I have, which is for Fernando. The Chancellor announced just before COP new sustainability disclosure requirements for businesses. This means that businesses, including pension funds, investment products, and asset managers, must start disclosing their environmental impact to investors and consumers. How much of a challenge will this pose to the sector?
I think the level of challenge will vary across the sector, because you have leading companies that are already disclosing kind of their impact, they are already putting together action plans, and you have other ones, I think, as Charlie mentioned in one of her first kind of response about, there's other small companies that they are very early on their journey, so they start understanding what are climate risks and what net zero means. So I think that's going to have different impact across the sector. So, and developing the disclosure requirement, and with a very clear standards, you create a level playing field. So enabling kind of different players should disclose same level of information that's going to be valuable for the market to assess what are the risks and what the actual plans. The important thing about using this new requirement about disclosing detailed transition plans, it shouldn't be seen as a tick box exercise just for compliance. Companies should really try to look at from an important tool to how you are going to be managing these transition risks. So if companies, they want to start committing to get to net zero or to reduce carbon, how to set a commitment if you don't know whether you're going to be able to achieve or how much that's going to cost. At normal business management perspective, that's what's required from all companies. And for some time, climate targets and climate change has been treated slightly different. You are allowed to have targets and don't know whether that they are achievable or not. And I think that's something that, using Landsec example, in 2019, we aligned our science-based target with a 1.5 degree to reduce our carbon emissions by 70% by 2030. And for us, that was the starting point for us for our net zero. And since 2019, what we've been doing, we start looking at exactly what we are going to need to do to deliver the 70% reduction, how we are going to decarbonize the building, and how much that's going to cost. And it was just kind of a couple of weeks ago that we were able to announce that that's going to cost us 135 million that we're going to need to be invested across our existing portfolio to reduce the energy consumption by updating the BMS. We are going to be deploying some artificial intelligence that we are trialing. We are going to be able to decarbonize heat by replacing end-of-life boilers with air source heat pumps, because we are not going to be replacing brand new boilers with new heat pumps. You're going to wait until they come to end of their lifetime, undertake a feasibility study. If it's possible to install, then we are going to replace, increase on-site generation, and then engage with customers as well and collaborate with customers. So now we have a very clear plan, and we know how much it's going to cost from now until 2030. And I think that's what's important, that companies, they need to understand that, yes, the requirement is one thing, but you need to put together this type of plan from a management perspective. Otherwise, they are going to be empty promises and kind of just long-term targets. And in the end, it may be too late to start taking action.
Thank you, Fernando. Yeah, I've got another question for the panel, and then I'm going to deal with a few questions that have come in from the audience. So this one, I'll start with you, Peter. But I think one of the key takeaways from COP was that there's still a lot of concern, especially from our young people, about greenwashing, including around investments where ESG claims perhaps do not stand up to scrutiny. How much of a problem in our sector do you think this is, and how do we tackle that? Is increased regulation the answer? So a nice easy one for you, Peter.
Oh yeah, that's it. I've just put everybody in our profession down then. Well, again, yeah, there is a significant amount of greenwashing still going on. I actually did another talk recently on COP26, and actually what I was saying, I called it chasing the ball, which is badge-driven design. So that was the kind of thing I was saying. So actually, we're making the wrong decisions by chasing badges. So things like neighbours, you know, we're going down the operational carbon route, but we're forgetting about the embodied carbon, you know, so all of these kinds of things were what I would term greenwash. And again, I'm going back to the UKGBC, which is actually a fantastic practical document about how to, if you like, I would say it's more about informing people about an approach, and a good approach, if you like, to dealing with the whole net zero carbon question. So again, that's good. And as we mentioned, the finance side, hopefully, if you like, all the checks and balances that are put in place to stop, if you like, that greenwashing situation that's going on, with, you know, with, I don't want to say JLL are here, but like things like the agents, they'll go and we'll stick this badge in the building, and then we'll tie tenants in on the basis of this idea. What we need to do is we need to get a bit more mature about our understanding about the things that we're doing to our buildings. And that can only come, if you like, in our world, from the finance side and the funding side. So if we can, if you like, educate, if you like, the finance and investment side, who will then put the checks and balances in place, right, to make sure our developers are not chasing the wrong objectives, right, and we're actually chasing the right objectives, then I think that's a way to do it. I think our legislation takes a bit long, if you like, to come in, and I think investment is a lot faster, if you like, to react to these changes. So I think that, if you like, is my view about how to move it a bit quicker, if you like. And we already see that. I mean, we've been speaking to various different investment companies about helping them, if you like, inform what they should be looking at when a developer comes to them and goes, I'm going to build a big glass building in Glasgow, which is freezing cold, and we're going to supply it from renewable electricity, right? Is that the right thing to do? I don't know, you know. So that to me is greenwashing. That's the kind of thing we need to be looking at things a bit more holistically with, if you like, science-based targets at the heart of it. Research supported decision making is a big thing, and we need to be more scientific about how we actually tackle our buildings. So that has to come, I think, firstly from investment and then from policy, which takes time to catch up on it.
Thanks for that, Peter. Nidhi, what's your thoughts on that?
Interestingly, I agree with Peter when he said about greenwashing, but I have another view to that as well, where, you know, when we're talking about greenwashing, a lot of the good stuff that is done by smaller initiatives or smaller companies or, you know, smaller projects, that gets a bit lost in translation because they feel that they've really done so much. It's not good to talk about it because it may be considered as greenwashing. So there is, I think, this is a problem as well. So the definition of greenwashing varies from person to person as it currently stands. And because we don't have a standard system in place or a regulation in place that puts, you know, assets in different boxes to say this is what you do to classify as green and this is what you do. So there are various different parameters that every asset class is being measured against, and there are different parameters developers or even finances would want to pick and choose for their particular fund or for their particular development. So overall, I think there has to be a standard in place, but until then, I think the word greenwashing can be posed as a problem to our sector, because a lot of the good things that are happening do not get that limelight, do not come into the forefront with the fear to be considered, as a greenwashing example. So that's, I think, one way of looking at it, which I think is quite key as well for our sector.
Thanks, Nidhi. And Charlie?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and looking at finance as being one of the pieces that possibly can support. Interestingly, so the stress testing piece and the methodology that we were required to use was based off EPCs, because for buildings, because EPC is the data that is readily available across all buildings in the UK in the majority of cases. So it's really hard when the data is not there, is not available, when you're doing things at a kind of mass level, or you're looking at something on a national basis. It's very hard to take into account, the whole piece around carbon. And absolutely, there's a bit about being honest about the bits we can measure today and the bits that we can't, and what we're doing to plug those gaps. But I think, again, there's a really big difference between cynically claiming green to obtain an economic benefit or an advantage versus actually doing what you can practically do today and being honest about where you need to get to. I don't think, otherwise we risk getting to a point where nobody will move for the fear of being accused of greenwashing. And then you don't get that momentum, and you don't get the innovation and the ideas flow about, right, okay, but how can we solve these other elements of it? So I think we needed to start somewhere, and we're learning as we're going. I think you do the best you can, and then once you know how to do better, then you do better. So I think there's just a bit of caution about it. It's really easy to shoot other people down on greenwashing. It's extremely easy to pick holes rather than making it, that's great, and you could also do this, or doing it as a positive encouragement for looking to reach higher, aim higher. So I think there's a bit of a balance, and it is very interesting for the real estate sector, again, because if you look at our smaller end of borrowers, getting them to try and then look at how they calculate embodied carbon, etc., it's not straightforward necessarily. And EPC is the measure that we have for today.
Can I come in an EPC question, Charlie?
Yeah.
I don't know if you know what I'm going to say. I don't know if the others know what I'm going to say. But the EPC is one of those badge-driven designs that actually doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And the reason is because, for example, as it stands today, unless they change it, it's still better to use gas than electricity when the carbon emissions for electricity are less than gas. So the EPCs actually, it's been irrelevant for about 10 years in terms of the carbon emissions with respect to the real, if you like, carbon emissions coming out of electrical networks against gas. And because of the pace of decarbonisation of the electrical networks, legislation doesn't seem to keep up and can't keep up because they keep putting out the consultation and it keeps changing. I'm hopeful that the next revision of Part L in Section 6, they'll actually recognise that and they'll change the carbon emission factors. And then we might get more realistic EPCs. But that's one of the things that I always say, take a word of caution with EPCs. That the data they're based on is massively out of date.
No, and we absolutely know that there are problems associated with it, and it's a very theoretical piece, and it's absolutely down to the quality of the assessment that's done as well, in terms of how far have they actually dug into the specifics around that building, and then the fact that they can be up to 10 years out of date is all not helpful. But what else do you use?
I know the DECs are a bit better. To be fair, the DECs in England are good, but again, that's after the event. So it's as a challenge, totally get it. And as you say, it's the best available data that you've got to work on at that point in time. But it's a comparative analysis against a notional fictitious building. But we've got the tools now to do it properly. So that's the good news.
Thanks for that, Peter and Charlie. Fernando, I want to give you an opportunity to comment on that greenwashing.
It was great to hear all reviews and agree with all of them. Yeah. Sometimes there are a fear of kind of saying anything out there with the concern of being tagged as labeled as greenwash, because you never know if it's kind of is exactly what is kind of is going to pass all kind of the level of scrutiny. But at the same time, we've seen a number of companies claiming net zero just based on offsets, and that and we know that, yes, that there was a point in time where we had absolutely no definition for net zero. So was that wrong? Maybe kind of it was an opportunity at that time for some companies to claim, but that definitely hasn't helped the discussions internally about building the business case for decarbonize, because then how you explain to your senior manager, so we need to decarbonize, we really need to invest big loads of money, when basically for 10 pounds per ton or even less, you can offset all your carbon emissions and claim net zero from day one. So that was kind of very deep, and that's where greenwashing becomes very, very dangerous, because then companies that are trying to take small steps to do the right thing gets kind of discouraged to keep doing, because some other player come and made a big commit based on offsets. So that's the challenge. But I think standards and definitions, they are evolving. So the UK GBC framework, the CRAM pathway for real estate, showing kind of the clear kind of, because we know, I think there are some concerns about the 2050 targets that they have that's completely unachievable. But let's think about what we can do for the next 10 years or so. And it looks kind of a reliable kind of pathway, a level, an achievable, at the same time, challenging level of reduction required from companies. So I think it's a credible. So we also have, as I mentioned before, the Science-Based Target Initiative, net zero standards. So these standards, they are coming, they are evolving. We all need to be a little bit patient and make sure that we are taking small steps, but we are getting to the right kind of achieving the right goal and getting where we need to, that is get to net zero and decarbonize our sector.
Thank you very much for that, Fernanda. We actually get some good questions come in here. So there's a related one and about greenwashing, and it's saying, would the panel recognise, and this is from Tim Brennan, would the panel recognise any of the offsetting schemes as valid, or should this solution be completely avoided? Who's going to take that up? Peter, you're smiling. You look as if you want to.
Yeah, I'm not a massive fan of offsetting, because what it does is it's offsetting by its very nature means that you're doing the wrong thing in the first place. So and that's the way people do it, and that's the way our building regs have been doing for years. So we reward, as I call it, bad energy architecture, by fastening all sorts of renewables onto a building. So I personally, I don't think it's the right approach. The right approach is to reduce the consumption of the building. And that's what we should be driving towards. So what we should be rewarding is how we are reducing our energy consumption and balancing that with the amount of materials, I keep saying, about balancing with the amount of material we need to put into buildings. So that's one of the issues. The other thing is some of the offsetting, if you like, elements are not properly policed. And again, that is another issue. Things like VGOs are coming into, the actual situation at the moment, being assessed again by Ofgem. So the REGO is the Renewable Energy Guarantee of Origin. So this is this aspect of going, I've got this big building and it's got 100% renewables and I'm good to go in net zero. Actually, the actual way to assess that and the way that it's done is flawed. And the other thing is about buying trees, if you like. So we're buying this amount of forest and stuff like, again, that's not very well regulated. So the offsetting actual situation it's not properly, if you like, policed, and that's one of the biggest issues. So then people like me go, if it's not being policed properly, it's open, if you like, to manipulation, and then it loses its whole power. So that's my view on offsetting.
Anyone else want to come in on that one?
I can say, I think when it comes to offsetting, that should be the last option that should be left for companies. And again, like Peter said, all the measures that can be taken to reduce the consumption, to look at renewable energy at source, producing renewable energy, and doing that should be the priority. And if you're looking at a company's action plan to get to net zero, offsets should come towards the very end. So if their net zero target is 2040 or 2050, offsets should be in that particular year, that you've tried everything across the years, because as we know, technology is improving. There are lots of innovations that are coming up, and we should be that confident today that by 2040 there will be ways to reduce your carbon emissions based on the new technologies, the new innovations that come up. So if you keep offsets in your action plans towards the very, very end of your timeline that you've got, then it makes sense, because, and that should again be very minimal. It cannot be 50% would be considered towards the end of your target. It should be perhaps 3% or 5%. And I think that's how you should tackle offsets at this stage, to have them towards the end as a last option.
Thanks for that, Nidhi. Yeah, I've got another good question here, and I think it gets to the crux of a lot of the issues that we have around the whole carbon agenda. But this one's anonymous, but COP26 and wider government policy has focused on electrification with green electricity. With electricity prices so high, are we heading into a massive affordability problem for many parts of the UK? What are the solutions to this? And Peter, I'm seeing you nodding furiously there, so
Yeah.
you've obviously got thoughts on this one.
Oh, massive, Kevin. Again, one of the things about the air source heat pump scenario we take at our government's driving us towards all electric solutions. However, again, if you go to the Ofgem website and you look down a breakdown, if you like, of the tariffs. So if you look at the tariff breakdowns, what you find is electricity has got a 23% tax on it versus gas, which is 1.86%. Which is ridiculous if you want people to move towards all electric buildings. The other thing is taking the question of, if you like, fuel, right? We get a massive amount of our fuel from not within our own island. You know, we connect to Europe, and the biggest drivers, if you like, that have driven up, if you like, the gas price, which drives up the electricity price, because guess what? We still have fossil fuel, if you like, power stations. So what's the solution? It's dead obvious, right? We need to be less reliant upon, if you like, other countries, if you like, for our fuel, right? So that means an increase, if you like, in renewables within our, if you like, island, and actually make it an electric island, almost cut off all the edges, so we're not reliant upon them, and we're in control of our energy and our economics in terms of our tariffs. We're not reliant upon others, or, if you like, held to ransom, which in essence is absolutely decimating the energy industry at the moment, because we're so reliant upon others for delivering our power and our heat to our buildings.
Thanks for that, Peter. Anyone else anything to add on that? If not, I've got some more questions here for you. This is from Alan at Morrison Construction, quite a technical one. As part of Article 6, Nidhi mentioned concrete zero and steel zero. What is the panel's view on what this actually means? Any takers for that one? Nidhi, do you want to come in?
I think, well, when it comes to implementing concrete zero and steel zero, I think the commitment is quite clear. I mean, we have to head to concrete zero, we have to head to steel zero. At this point in time, we don't have a solution. So investing in technology, investing in innovation to lead into concrete, producing zero embodied carbon, I think that's like the biggest step that we would take. And there are some researches that are already being carried out to get our concrete to produce or have zero carbon concrete in place. I think Fernando also mentioned about Lynn signing up for steel zero, so perhaps she can touch on the steel aspect, but addressing concrete is a very big thing, and it will take time, and it's an industry that is a heavy polluter in the current state, and I think there is a huge amount of work to be done in that area. So this COP26, it was a starting point. What it means will eventually unfold, but at least we've started that journey today. I think that's quite key.
Thanks, Nidhi. Fernando, do you want to follow on?
Yes, so as I said, we joined 2019, we joined the Steel Zero initiative. It's a global initiative led by the Climate Group, bringing together main kind of members organizations that procure lots of steel. We do because across our development pipeline. In that commitment, all these member organizations, we are committing ourselves to start procuring steel zero. And we want to procure 100% of steel zero by 2050. And as an interim target in 2030, by 2030, we are going to be purchasing steel from companies that have science-based targets. So because right now there is no true completely still zero. We need to know that they are taking the right steps to decarbonize their process and to get to zero. So these were the science-based target is one of kind of the metrics or the criteria that one company can say that they are on their pathway to get to still zero. So I can, in their website, they have more information, but kind of this is kind of the high level idea about how that demand side commitment works, just to incentivize steel companies to invest in technology and to decarbonize their process.
Thanks, Fernanda. Another question here from the audience. Do the UK GBC net zero carbon roadmap and the planned new and updated building regulations align in their steps and requirements for a net zero carbon built environment? So is there alignment between that? Do you want to try that one, Charlie?
I'm definitely not the right person to answer that question. Peter, I don't know if you...
I'm trying to think about the numbers about it. They can't strictly align, if you like. I think their objectives are the same, if that makes sense, but it's difficult to make them align because there's obviously these are documents that are in consultation at the moment. And as I say, the Part L, if you like, side of things just doesn't go far enough. So that doesn't really meet with the objectives of the UK GBC. The Future Home Standard is about the domestic side. And again, I don't know the exact numbers. It's hard to remember them all. But they are obviously on a low energy trajectory. And obviously the target is not to have things like PVs as offsets, even locally. And that's in that proposal. Whereas the Part L are suggesting, as I say, they're throwing PVs at a building to deal with a poor performing building. And that's what the Part L 2021 is doing. But the UK GBC, again, doesn't follow that. What it's trying to do is reduce energy, then you top up a little bit. And then if you can't get any further, then you use that awful, if you like, offsetting situation at the end, which is a bit unregulated, and but it's all we've got, to be fair. So I don't think they completely align, but I think the objectives align, but the numbers don't.
Nidhi or Fernando, have you any comments on that?
I would just say that the UK GBC has been quite key in the consultation process of these documents. They've organised various different workshops with their members to lobby against these regulations and make sure that the right things are embedded into them. So I would say UK GBC always set the standards high for the government to follow. That's how I would put it.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, Fernando, have you anything on that one, or will we move on? No. Okay. So just conscious of time, and we're getting close to when we need to wind up. But another question for the panel that I have is that ministers were keen to claim at COP that the UK is a world leader in tackling climate change. In our sector, do you think this is true? What would you point to as world leading? And where do we need to be better? So maybe start with you, Charlie, on that one.
So we're very UK focused in our activities, but I am aware of other countries which sometimes out of necessity are significantly further ahead in how they even just regulate some of the activity in the built environment. So if we think of somewhere, I think the Netherlands, etc., tends to be further ahead in their climate consideration. So I think I think we're good at accelerating once we've decided on something, mobilising and pushing things forward and having the component parts is, I think, a strength of the UK. But I'm not sure that I'm convinced that we are leading the way today. Happy to be challenged on that from any of the other panel members, though.
Fernando.
Yeah, no, I agree with Charlie. We also, Landsec, we just had a UK-based portfolio, so I just know kind of other countries by talking with some peers, with investors, and I know that the Nordic countries, they are quite advanced, particularly kind of Sweden as well. I've never confirmed to see how much that is true, but to get planning permission to build a new building in Sweden, you basically need to show that your building is going to be true net zero energy. So basically, yes, maybe you're not going to generate all electricity, all energy on site, but you need to somehow generate that required energy off-site, and that's gonna be powering something else. But overall, the build is gonna be net zero, and that's quite kind of advanced. I don't know if that would be possible here in the UK, but I think this difference, and I think makes kind of the Nordic countries quite interesting to see from kind of the build sector perspective.
Yeah. Needy, JLL, more international maybe than our previous panel members. So what's your thoughts on it? Are we world leaders or are we still lagging?
I would say we're one of the world leaders. There are, I think in the UK, what is good is the regulations have picked up quite a few things when it comes to climate change, carbon, sustainability. So I see a lot when it comes to Asia Pacific. The intent is there, but because the regulations don't drive things there, and finance does to a certain degree, the push for the real estate sector to get to that zero carbon, you've got to really put efforts there to drive the agenda. So I think Asia Pacific still upcoming. When it comes to Europe and UK, we have got quite a few good examples of, where we are leading the world, basically showing them the way of how we can do things. In Americas, it's a bit disintegrated in the sense where there are certain parts of America where the regulations have really gone far ahead and they are at par or sometimes even better than what we are doing here in the UK. So California, for example, New York, for example, as a city has now launched a carbon tax for the existing buildings portfolio, which is about $268 per ton of carbon, which will now apply to the buildings that currently exist. So overall, I'd say it's a mix. I wouldn't class ourselves as world leader in that matter. I would say we are one of the leading nations in this area.
Thanks, Needy. And Peter, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm with Needy on this. I think we're not the best, but we're certainly by far not the worst. I think we are, as a nation, innovators, and again, a lot of the things that we can come up with in this nation in terms of some of the technologies actually get implemented in other countries before we implement them. For example, things like hydrogen and stuff like that, we've been leading the way for a long time in that, but other countries are actually taking it on board. The US, we've got offices in the US and both in California and New York, and but they get very frustrated in the US because the rest of the US is not like that. It's the opposite. The US has actually got this kind of complete opposite. Some states are amazing and some are like the worst in the world, so I think as nations, and again, having joined up processes and things like that, which we do have in the UK, everything's a UK, energy's a UK centric thing. It's not been regionalized, if you like. There are regions within the UK that could do a hell of a lot better. Places like South Wales are the worst in terms of the carbon emissions, in terms of where their fuel comes from in the UK. So what we probably should be looking at is looking at the regions and looking at how we decarbonise these areas. Most of that's down to their fuel supply. In Scotland, for example, a vast majority of the time, Scotland is zero carbon, mainly because of hydro, nuclear, and wind. So again, it's looking at the micro scale as well as the macro scale. But again, we're not world leading. We could be better. Can always be better. If we were world leading, we probably wouldn't be having this debate and discussion, and actually questioning ourselves all the time. And I think that's good to do. But yeah, we're doing some good stuff, but we could always do better.
A long way to go yet. Anyway, you'll be glad to know I've got a final question for you, panel. So ahead of COP, the government published the long-awaited heat and building strategy. Good that the strategy is finally out, but a lack of ambition on phasing out of gas and delivering a national retrofit programme, and no answers to how we tackle embodied carbon emissions, which we touched on earlier. Am I being unfair? How would you rate this strategy and what was missing for you? So maybe start with you in that one, Peter.
Yeah, I think one of the problems is the government usually come out with these things and go, right, go and solve the problem that we've just created. And again, what we've had to do is react to a lot of the kind of elements in it. Now, the big picture stuff is about this decarbonisation, but also increasing the capacity of, I feel like, electrical networks, because that's where they've driven it towards. And I think that's where the challenges lie. But I think the good news is over the last couple of years, certainly you can see the national grid has responded really well. A huge amount of research about how to solve it in a long-term trajectory, and which indicates, believe it or not, a net zero carbon electrical network between 2030 and 2035, which I think Boris mentioned recently. But that's actually in the Future Energy Scenarios document that was published by the National Grid in July this year. But again, you know, it's like when you get this legislation coming out, everybody has to react, or guidance, I feel like, that comes out, we have to react to it. But that tends to be the way of things.
Thanks, Peter. Charlie?
Yeah, look, I mean, we were pleased it was released. That was definitely a step forward, and actually good to see the owner-occupier being referenced as well, because in terms of buildings, that's, you know, huge swathe is then owner-occupier, and actually mobilising them in the same direction potentially means that the solutions become scalable as well, and just in terms of reassuring the supply chain. But yeah, lots of gaps and not necessarily the tangible action plans. I think even around the kind of MEES, the direction of travel under MEES was reaffirmed, but not with any sort of support around how enforcement will happen, sort of resource for local authorities, etc., on that side of things, and not the actual date of when they're going to press the button on that MEES side of things as well. So some quite obvious gaps there. And I think it's also, when we're looking at the solutions, we probably need to be deploying everything. And some of those sort of, like, if you're looking at district heating plans, that needs to be coordinated. And I think that some of that side of things was, again, very much, as Peter said, you know, here's the plan, you go and solve it. So there was some bits and pieces where I think we need to see that coordination come together, and it probably, some of that does still need to be led by government.
Thanks, Charlie. Fernando?
Yes, yeah, no, I agree with what was said. I think another good thing about the heat and build strategy was about the confirmation of the implementation of performance-based rating for buildings, which address some of the issues that was discussed about EPCs. So actually measuring the actual performance, energy performance of buildings, that's a welcome development. Keen to see how that's going to be actually implemented, because I think their timeline is quite kind of, I think the first rates they are planning to do between 2022 and 2023, which seems very, very ambitious without having a clear plan from the beginning. But yeah, a movement in the right direction. So that was a good thing from that strategy.
Great. And a final word to Needy on this. We're fast approaching 11:30, but if you can just say.
Yeah, I think everything, the good things that were said, I agree with them. But yeah, the retrofit program, which has not been referenced, which has not been given enough attention in terms of resources, planning and monitoring, I think that's the big one, because we've got a lot of existing stock that needs to be addressed. So that was a big gap, I think, in that strategy.
Great. Well, I need to bring things to a close now, or I'll get my knuckles wrapped for running over. So I thought that was very informative, very insightful, and a great panel discussion. There's lots for us all to do and think about, and more no doubt to come. However, the main thing I think is what everyone's saying is we need more action. I would like to thank Needy, Charlie, Fernanda and Peter for their time this morning and for sharing their thoughts with us. Thought it was a great discussion from some real experts. I would also like to thank you all for attending, and I hope you all have a great day. As you can see, the sun's shining here in Edinburgh, so we'll bring things to a close at that point. Thank you very much. Thank you.